This is really a very thought-provoking chapter because we kind of see Israel as it was as a nation, not as a entity, you know, just a religious organization or this religious ideal. We really see Israel as the nation that it was and kind of get an idea as to what separated Israel from other ancient nations. So it is something that, to me, this was really where I think began to just fall in love with the way of life that God gave to ancient Israel, everything that he taught them how to do. I just really fell in love with all the differences that we see. And that's really what this chapter begins to examine, because when I put God on trial and when I had to ask questions as to what separated him from the other competing deities of the day and what separated him from the other nations. You know, the claim is made in Genesis as well as by the prophets that God gave a truth to Abraham that the other nations did not have. So as I investigated that and as I researched it, it is the second part of chapter 5 that really draws that distinction and makes it very clear. So one of the first questions that we asked, and we are beginning on page 170, is what is a holy nation? You know, throughout scripture, we see this call for Israel to become this holy nation, this segula, this holy and set apart people. So how does this happen? What are the steps that you take in order to become this incredibly, you know, according to the text, it's an incredibly righteous nation. So what do you do to do that? Well, you find that God gave them statutes, judgments, and laws to live by. And as you look through the text, I'm going to get my notes here. As you look through the text, you find that all of these things really establish a national constitution, a way of life for Israel to live by, a way of life that benefited their entire society. And it's a way of life that we find is very parallel to the American Constitution. So one thing that, you know, I found in a lot of atheistic arguments, as well as a lot of arguments from, I would just say, a lot of those that are critical of the text, is the idea that Israel, and even within some religious people, I've seen this as well, that Israel, if they are a holy nation, if they are a set apart people, they should bear no similarities, and there should be no crossover with the other nations of the day. Hold on just a minute. Can you say hello? Okay, why don't you go see Grandma right now? I know, I don't know if you saw the pictures I posted on Facebook. He knows I'm leaving tomorrow. I'm going to Israel. Okay, let me go see Grandma right now. Go on. With the idea of the holy nation, there's this idea that Israel should not bear any similarities, no customs, no rituals. You know, especially if it's coming to anything religiously, there should be no crossover in the traditions and the customs that they participated in. But we find this is not the case. And when you start looking at ancient Israel, you find that they had a lot of customs, a lot of religious ceremonies, very much compatible and very much not in harmony, but it was the same function. Sacrifices. Other ancient nations did sacrifices. Other ancient nations had temples that were very similar. So we're going to look at some of that tonight. You know, what we find, if you look at pages 170 and 171, Deuteronomy 26:16 through 19, is this, again, this idea that if you keep the statutes, judgments, and commandments, the way of YHWH, that in and of itself is what separates ancient Israel from other nations. You know, other nations had parts of the law. You know, the Hammurabi Code embraced part of it, but certainly not all of it. The Egyptian laws of Mat, they paralleled a little bit of it, but when you look at the complete package, the crossover was never complete with any nation, and there were things that would contradict it. You know, the Hammurabi Code was, I would say, very unjust and very harsh in its treatment of engineers. You know, the Hammurabi Code says if an engineer builds a house and it falls down, the engineer is put to death. If a physician performs a surgery and the patient dies at any point in time, the physician is being put to death. So, it's a very harsh law that you don't see Torah embracing. Torah, when you compare it, really has a lot milder judgments and is a much broader. And it is in that broadness that you find a lot of peace as well as a lot of liberty. Let me look up this text. I wanted to share this with you guys and I didn't have time before we started. Okay. In Psalms 119, and this is going to be verse 96, David says, I have seen an end of all perfection. And he contrasts that against the law, and he says, but behold, your commandment is exceedingly broad. So it's this idea that when you get into whether it's religious ideals or governmental ideas that get very specific on how you should live your life, on what you should wear, what you shouldn't wear, how you should sneeze, the type of music you listen to. When you get into where you begin limiting, and you limit this and you rule out that, and you just shrink it shorter and shorter and shorter, you begin to limit freedom. You limit liberty. And David contrasts that. He says that, the narrow way is a way of oppression, is kind of the tenure of his statement, whereas the Torah is exceedingly broad in what it commands Israel to do, in the way that it commands ancient Israel to live their lives, conduct their society, and order their government. So that is one of the first contrasts that we see. And again, that verse that I just quoted from, I'm going to give that to you again one more time, is Psalms 119:96. So continuing on, as we get into what I call the myths of ancient Israel, and again, it's this idea that ancient Israel should have had no similarities with other ancient nations, kind of like this Amish or Mennonite interpretation of scripture, where you really become antisocial. If society is doing it, it must be going to hell in a handbasket. And that really is not the philosophy that we find in the biblical text. When we begin looking at the biblical text, we find that there were a lot of customs, there were a lot of practices, and the world actually worked very similar in Israel, as in Egypt, as in Mesopotamia. It was just simply the world that they live in. So let's look at those crossover of customs. One of them was primogeniture, which is the custom of inheritance. Both in scripture as well as in Mesopotamia, the firstborn son inherited a double portion. You find that then the other sons in the family would inherit a single portion of land. The firstborn son also had some leadership responsibilities to the family as well. You find that all nations had this custom of taking solemn oaths. Sometimes it accompanied sacrifices. Usually it did, as sealing the oath, and that validated your word. Today, that custom has changed, and all that we do is sign our name to a contract. We looked at that in greater detail when we looked at the patriarchal covenants a few chapters ago. We also find that ancient temples of the day, were constructed very similarly. They had an outer court, an inner court. They had pillars. When you look at, and I put on here the temple of Edfu in Egypt. Now, this is a later temple. This dates to 230. So you could say that it had some Solomonic influence. We really can't judge that one way or the other. The Solomon temple had been destroyed for about almost 300 years. So we don't know what influence that may have had, but we do know, based on other Egyptian temples, that Israel's temple had some similarity. So there was some crossover there. Now, what's going to be interesting as we get into chapters 13 and 14, we're going to see that the exact structure of Israel's temple, which was different from other nations, held prophetic significance for ancient Israel, and it actually prophesied of Israel's future. So it was a testimony contained in and of itself. You had the prophets, but you also had the temple structure, the temple implements that were used to convey a lot of the ideas that had been established within the patriarchal covenants. Let me know, just to let you guys know, we are on the forefront of a lot of storms that are coming through. So if my feed gets bad or if there's other issues, please just type in the chat and let me know as we go along. And we'll either slow it down or try to do something to make up for that. The other thing that we find is that the liturgy of the day was very similar. Other ancient nations wrote psalms. The Songs of Solomon, which was a love song to his Egyptian bride. That was popular in ancient Egypt. It was popular in Mesopotamia. It was just simply a form of liturgy that was very common in the day. Now, doesn't make them invalid, the fact that Egypt had songs long before Israel came along, but it was just a valid form of expression. The other thing that they had were this idea of high places. The temple, the first temple, is built on a high place, a mount within Israel. And that was done twofold. Your temples usually served as defensive, as defensive fortifications, places of protection militarily. They also served, of course, as a religious center that people came to, as well as a social center and a form of government. Throughout Scripture, you find that is in both ancient Israel as well as in other ancient nations, the temple served as a depository for administrative documents. I am getting some lightning here, so if we have to bow out, we'll try to come back on a little bit later. I'm going to try to go as long as we can here. You find that one of the stipulations of the Abrahamic covenant, and especially of Israel's first covenant, was that it was supposed to be deposited in the temple, or actually in the Ark of the Covenant, which was housed in the temple and then read before the entire nation every year. So, and this was very similar to other ancient nations that you had as well, because that was a similar requirement. All right, I'm going to catch some comments here. Maria says, the more I read of your book, the more I like the Torah due to your take on it. Oh, wonderful, Maria. I'm so glad. I believe that's Alejandra. I'm not sure. I think you guys' names are backwards, but I'm not sure. And then Stephen says, have you ever read something about the nations also using fringes like Israel was commanded of the tzitzit? Actually, yes. And as you get in, it might be chapter 7. My take on the tzitzit is different than the modern Jewish understanding. If you look, okay, great, Steve. Glad you're here. If you look at the stele of Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, he has an image on there, a carving in this black basalt stele of Jehu, the king of Israel, bowing down before him. If you look at the fringe he is wearing, because in Scripture it is a fringe that's commanded, even though we see it as we see it as, you know, a four-cornered garment. That's not really how they understood it in the day. The idiom four corners was used for either four corners of the earth or four corners of a garment, and it was always used to denote a circumference. So when you look at this command to wear fringes, it was something that went around the entire outer border or circumference of the garment. And if you look at Jehu, I think that's a very accurate representation of this fringe that went around the entire garment. And you see it both in Assyrian as well as in Philistine garments, where this fringe encircled the entire skirt, and sometimes it even kind of came up the skirt. I actually have a picture here. I'm not sure. Let me see if I can get it. You know, I'll come back to it before we finish up and see if I can find it and show it to you. If not, I'll email it to the list, hopefully before I go. If not, I'll do it when I get back. Just remind me. So we find this idea of very contemporary practices. The breastplate that Aaron wore was for oracle pronouncements. Other nations had that. Greece had type of oracle pronouncements, sometimes with stones. You know, there was a stone that was supposed to reveal certain answers. You also had circumcision in Egypt since early dynastic periods. Now, I argue that all of these similarities and all of these compatibilities with Torah demonstrate that Noah and all nations at one point in time had a very limited understanding and a very limited framework of the law that was re-given to Moses. So I really do think that at one point in time, many of the nations had the Torah in a very limited form, and they departed from it. Hold on real quick. Let me get some some water. Hold on. Jack, could you bring me a glass of water, please? Thank you. Forgot to get it before I started today. Oh, the fringes, I'm not sure which name. Are we talking about tzitzit? My Hebrew may not have pronounced it correctly. I am pronouncing it the way that I've heard other native speakers say it, but I could be doing it wrong. So let me know, Steve, if I've said it wrong. You find other similarities between Israel and ancient nations. You find that the calendars, Israel's calendar, thank you, function very similar to other ancient nations, especially Babylon, right around the 7th century. The calendars were very similar. But there were distinctions. So, I think we have to be really careful when we talk about Israel being a separate nation, that when we talk about Israel being different than the other nations, that we don't interject our own thoughts and our own philosophies of what we think it means for Israel to be different. And we really stick with what the text, because the text really reveals that it was the exact stipulations, the commandments, statutes, and judgments that separated Israel. Thank you, Steve, for that phonetics. I appreciate that. I'll try to remember it. Okay, the other thing, but we do find as we go on that there were specific things that the Torah bans, specific practices that God found harmful to his set-apart people and to his Segulah. You find that homosexuality was one of the practices, bestiality, cutting yourself as a form of bereavement, as a form of mourning the dead, making permanent markings on your skin, marking again for bereavement. Those were things that separated Israel as a righteous society. We also find as we get in, I think where we see it more than anything is as we get into the government. This idea of constitutional taxation. I think that so many of your problems with government excess, your problems of government oppression are really solved when you limit the tax base and you limit the tax revenues, because it limits, or it doesn't limit, but it puts a stopgap to the amount of oppression the government can assume when those taxes and that income is limited. The law banned corvée labor of Israel's citizenry, even though they could conscript it from foreigners and from other nations within the area. They could not do that from their own people. So that was something that separated. In Egypt, Egypt would require corvée of its own citizens. Mesopotamia, we really don't know, but we do know that as the priesthoods assumed more and more power, and they really functioned like corporations, we find that these temple corporations really assumed a lot of power, and they displaced people from their land. People would become poor, they'd become impoverished, the priesthood would buy their land, displace them. Then these people would either migrate to other nations where they would have very little rights, they'd become basically slaves in other nations, or if they stayed in their own land and in their own territory, they would almost become wards of the state. They were given a place to live within the temple, a little 8 by 8 room, sometimes housed like a family of 6 or 8. And they became wards of the state, where all day long they may be basket weavers or pottery makers or something like this. So you find that really a lot of these temples were the profiteers, the marketers of this slave labor and this compulsory labor, simply because people had no other options, and that was their last option to really, resort to the priesthood for shelter and protection. But at the same time, it really wasn't shelter and protection, it was exploitation. We find that Israel's system totally banned those type of practices. So that's one dichotomy that we see that separated ancient Israel from other nations. We're going to come back to these ideas that separated Israel in a minute. First, I want to discuss this idea that a lot of people, at least when I think I even went through this as I was searching and as I was questioning where I stood and what I believed. And that is the idea that the Torah should be omniscient. It should have given Israel all understanding, all truth, almost made them a technologically advanced society. And that is just a very, I believe, poor way of thinking about it, just not a he never, unless something was directly harmful to his people, say like homosexuality, he never really bans anything. Polygamy, he doesn't ban it because there was actually a necessity to it to keep their population cogent and their strong population within their society. So he allowed polygamy. Not that it's the ideal, but it was not something that he banned because it helped Israel stay strong militarily as well as strong to possess the land. But those things that actually directly harmed his people, whether it be with disease or something that was very socially negative, he banned those practices. And we really find that the Torah parallels natural law. So the laws, we touched on this last time, the laws that God gave that form the universe by, the laws by which the universe functions, he uses those laws to give us a moral code, to give us a constitution that our nation should be run by and should parallel. So the laws that work in the creation of the universe, the laws that work well in governing physics and how our universe works, are given to us in a law that we can actually apply as something that's very real for our society. And the other thing that we find in the Torah is that God always gives you what you seek. So if you seek good things, you're going to receive good things. And if you seek poor things, you're going to find those. And we're going to come back to that in just a minute. So let's look at some of the ways that the law is good for humanity. This was something that for me, I would say 80% of my investigation rested on this question. If God had given to ancient Israel a law that led to death, a law that was dysfunctional, a law that could not be observed. Remember, that was ancient Israel, Micah 6:2. Ancient Israel's allegation in Micah 6:2 said, "Behold, the way of Yahweh is unequal. It cannot be kept. It is too hard for us." Ezekiel 18, Ezekiel 33 reiterate the same concept that ancient Israel had. And you know, a lot of traditional modern Christian theology really reiterates that same argument, that the law is too hard, it cannot be kept. God gave it just to show us incapable. You know, if that is the case, if God did that, then he is not a righteous God, because you don't give somebody something that they cannot do. And if you look at Deuteronomy 30 verses 8, I forgot to turn this off, hold on. You look at Deuteronomy 30 verses 15, around verse 15, you find that it says that the law is very easy to obey. It's very easy to follow. And so when you apply that, you find that the law is something that's very good for humanity, something we can do, and something that benefits us. So it makes you a holy nation. It makes you a set apart people by following this for your society. You know, it's very hard for us in diaspora to live by this entire way of life. You know, we can, where we can apply it to our lives, but on a national level, where our policies, our national policies, our community policies function according to it, and we receive those benefits, as we are going to get into this information, you're going to see that it really becomes, it's not always realistic. So this is where the hope of the return, the hope of the restoration comes in, so that we can live by this very broad law, this way of life that it just grants incredible peace and incredible liberty. So one of the things that we find, and now I'm on page 174 if you guys want to follow along, the function of the temple and the priesthood. You know, anciently, sin functioned much differently than our modern religious context. In a modern religious context, people think of sin as simply you've broken the law and you sinned against God. And a lot of times today, we find that if you think something in your heart, or if something comes into your mind, you think about something that's evil, or you think about something that is negative, people will tag that as sin. And they will say, well, you've thought about something that violates the law, or maybe your heart wasn't in the right place. While the prophets and scripture says that the heart is very important and that sin originates in the heart, the Torah itself does not deem it as sin until it manifests itself into a physical action. So in ancient Israel, sin was a political designation, just as crime is a political definition today. So today, if the law states that you are not to smoke marijuana in a particular state, if you violate that and you've committed a crime and you're charged with that crime, well then to put this in an ancient context, you would have been considered to have sinned against the state and against God, because God, there's this idea that the state represented God. So the state act in God's behalf, administrating justice and righteousness, judging between the guilty and the righteous in human affairs. We also find that politics was very much a part of this, and God established these things for us to be benefit. Let me read something to you, and I'm going to read this on page 175 because I think this author really states it even better than what I do. I'm going to begin with page 175, about midway through, right beside the map. It says, no separation existed between priesthood and state. Instead, the priesthood was an extension of the state and was given the divine right to teach the nation's judgments, statutes, and commands, and laws to the people in the same way that American schools are supposed to teach the U.S. Constitution to its citizens today. Moreover, the priesthood was to judge the nation when the people rebelled. Priests were legal advisors, theologians, judges, scribes, and public servants. And this is what Marty Stevens said. Stevens states, he says, worship is not disconnected from politics, economics, or sociology. And look at how this contrasts to our modern government and the modern political field in America today, where there is this idea that church and state have to be so separated. You can't even pray on a football field, and if you do, you lose your job. That is not at all in the spirit of the U.S. Constitution or the Torah Constitution, where in American history, every single founding father, even deists, our founding fathers who were deists, weren't exactly sure where they stood on God. Every single one of them prayed on government property. Every single one of them prayed in government buildings. Conveniently left out of modern discussions as far as policy, conveniently left out of modern Supreme Court considerations of interpretation and our founding fathers' interpretation of the U.S. Constitution, and an ancient concept of interpreting ancient Israel's constitution, where economics, politics, and sociology all converged within one institution to provide a lot of peace. When you begin to divide it, you begin to separate it, you begin to segregate it to that extent, it really becomes oppressive, and where, this has to fit into this box and another part has to fit into another box, and that's simply not how life works. So the Torah is really a lot more realistic in how these different fields and how these different areas overlap and interplay in day-to-day living. So I'm going to continue with Marty Stevens and what he says. He says, if one central institution served multiple functions in ancient Israelite society, the society understood those functions to be integrated in life. Western democratic separation of church and state has artificially divided life into arenas of sacred and secular, dividing economics from religion. I do suggest that the life of discipleship is not to be divided into sacred and secular as our modern tendency. The biblical prophets precede me in this regard, announcing that worship without economic justice and societal righteousness is an abomination to the one we worship. You know, this is so true. And it makes me so sick when I see these preachers that say, sow your seed, you know, give me your money. You know, little old ladies, send me your grocery money as seed capital. Go hungry this week. Give me your money for your medicine. Sow your seed. Give me your money, and God will bless you. That is not economic justice. And for these preachers to take advantage of the poor, of the people who aren't so bright, and the people who aren't so educated, or the people who are just living in fear and want that comfort, to me, that is one of the most egregious sins that you can commit. And the fact that, too, you know, how do you hear from the pulpit? When was the last time that you really heard the idea of a economic policy? You know, we tend to think that economic policy is a matter of Congress. It's for the president. It's for Congress and maybe even the Senate to debate, to decide, to discuss. But it's not for theologians to discuss. You know, that flies in the face of everything that God laid down with ancient Israel, because he sets in stone within the law of Moses an economic policy that, again, limits the government so that it could remain broad and then society could remain free. So we find that, I'm going to continue with what Marty says here. He says, I hope that understanding the economic role of the Jerusalem temple may help us recapture something of the integrative, holistic character of life that our ancestors in the faith experienced. You know, I really think that the term holistic encapsulates what ancient Israel, how they viewed their relationship with God and the state, and how their society functioned. That really captures, I think, the foundation of this way of Yahovah. Darren Sanders says, using the name of the Almighty to gain wealth is beyond low. Absolutely. You know, and they don't even have to use the name. I mean, they'll say, you know, in God's name, in Jesus' name. It doesn't matter. There's no consequence with these guys. They have, I mean, if you look at it and go to YouTube and just watch some of these videos, some of them have 5 jets, some of them have 2 jets. They have 5 or 6 multi-million-dollar homes. There is no fear of God. There's no idea that there will ever be any accountability, or that they will be held accountable for any of this in any way. And they're just taking care of, I mean, they're living off of the poorest of the land and taking advantage of them. And it's just beyond horrific, you know. And then you have your faith healers, which we're going to actually look at a little bit here, because ancient society was a smidgen similar to that. Not, I believe, as egregious as some of your Benny Hinns of today, but they were definitely similar in the way that they function. So let's look at ancient Israel's priesthood. You know, the priests were they were public servants. They maintained public records. Remember, when Jeremiah buys the land, they talk about it being buried or being deposited in the temple, and God says, no, don't put it there, bury it, because knowing the temple is going to be destroyed, all those records and those administrative documents would be destroyed as well. When archaeologists excavate ancient temples, those are usually the most prime prize of the excavation, because when they are excavated, you find the rich documents, whether they're legal transactions, sale of slaves, sale of grain, sale of property. All of those transactions are deposited in those temple administrations. Can you imagine how much room would be taken in a temple where you have clay tablets that are recording all of this? So you had a lot of room being taken. And what you'd find is that every so often the priests would purge their archives, and you'd find these dumps back behind the temple where some of these documents would be kind of trashed after so many years. We also find that the temple served as a sort of federal reserve system. It would establish a system of weights and measurements, or a system of currency. You know, Israel did have a gold and silver standard. I do not necessarily think that when Israel is restored that that will be required. And let me share with you why, because I know a lot of people are very pro gold standard. When you take all of the gold that's available in the world, it is a very limited resource, and it is not something that can be universally held by everyone. So what that means, hold on. Yes, I see you, love. Are you hiding behind me? Can you say hello? All right, go see Daddy, please. I know. Go see Daddy and I'll rock you a little bit, okay? Right now. I know. Right now. Love you. So when you take that gold and you consider the availability of a limited resource, and you consider that gold itself makes some people wealthy and some people poor because it cannot be universally acquired, I do believe that a universal currency as we have today that's backed by a strong economy will be probably something that will be allowed in Israel's future. And again, I am speculating here, but just based on economics, but again, to have a strong back currency, a paper currency or a metal currency, it really has to be backed by a very strong economy that is not based on debt. So I think those will probably be where the focus is at the restoration, and not so much on a gold or silver standard that leaves some people very wealthy and some people very poor. Going on to different ideas of Israel. We find that one thing that this is a separation, a dichotomy between ancient Israel and other nations. Ancient temples always participated in loans. So you would have the temple loaning to people at very exorbitant rates. And by doing this, when the person defaulted, guess what? The temple was able to gain more land when the person defaulted. And these temples became these huge entire empires, and sometimes the empires competed with the monarchy. Sometimes the temples toppled the monarchy, and then sometimes the monarch was able to subvert the temples and take advantage of those resources for its own desires and its own policies. But you find that just having that huge entity was really an issue because it provided an avenue to oppression and an avenue of taking advantage of the disadvantage. And again, that was done because of these interest rates. So one thing that is just flat out banned in Israel was for the temple or for government in any way to issue government loans. Now, we find out in Ezekiel and in other places that that may have extended to the ordinary citizen. Now, let me distinguish one way in which usury is different from modern loans. Anciently, usury, not only would you have a deposit that you paid, but if you defaulted, you would lose your land. In Israel, this was not a valid scenario. It was not legal because a person's land was their heritage. So if you lived in the countryside, you had arable lands, that land was passed down father to son throughout your generations. The land could never be sold according to Numbers 25. It always remained in your family. So if you had a loan and you defaulted on the loan, you could sell you and your family into slavery, but that land itself could never be given to anyone. Now, legally, you could be required to lease the land for up to 25 years to repay debts. Usually it was a period of 6 years. So that could be a valid option to repay your debts, but never could that land be taken from you. So it made usury illegal because, again, usury in a contemporary setting, in a contemporary economic context, was the fact that if you defaulted on the loan, your entire property was confiscated, so that you lost your clothing, you lost your furniture, you lost your land and your home. And the United States is really righteous in that although it allows loans, if they can never call the loan, like for instance, if you're at the bank if you owe money to the bank can never say, okay, I want the full balance of my loan today. So that is very good, because that is something Torah would ban. You know, they could never call it early. Now, you have other stipulations, you know, this idea of forgiving debt every 7 years. That also kept Israel very, very honest, and kept debt very, very low, and not something that society could really be based on economically, because you had stopgaps. You had things that made a debt-based society very hard to develop within Israel's socioeconomic policies. You also find that the other way that God limited Israel's government, first of all, we are going to see that he limited ancient Israel's government through taxation, but he also limited Israel's government through the land resources that they could hold on to and own. So at the conquest, when Israel came into the land, God divides the arable land. This arable land would have been income-producing estates, vineyards, fields, you know, of wheat, crops, all these, you know, a place where you could even set up a dye business or a clothing manufacturing business. We find that in Chronicles, it talks about the Ashbites and how this family had a textile industry within their family that was very profitable, and they were very wealthy from this. But again, that came because they had these very large arable estates. The government, Israel's government, the Levites, were banned from owning any arable lands. This meant that the tasks that they could assume, the buildings that they had for administrative purposes, were very limited as far as what they could supply and provide for ancient Israel. So what did this mean? This meant that certain things had to come from the private sector, either organization within the private sector to provide it for themselves, or it had to come from generous philanthropists. But the government itself was very limited on the services it could provide, as well as the power it could assume. So the first way was through land. The only lands that the Levites were given were outside of the administrative centers, where you had a city of refuge, where the person who committed involuntary manslaughter, he would flee there for protection. I can tend to think of it as a county seat. So if you think of all of your Levites really living in these county seats of government, and they may have had up to maybe 5 acres to their name, nothing that you could really produce an income with, but something where you could sustain your own family. That would probably be, you know, they would live in perhaps a subdivision or something within those outlying territories to the city. And again, that served to protect Israel. You also find that astronomy was a branch of temple service. Throughout history, your government was very much concerned with calendars and making sure that the calendar stayed in sync with both the lunar and the solar. When we talk about ancient Israel's calendar, we really have to take into effect the fact that at the Sinai, Leviticus 23, when that was given, if the stories in Scripture are valid, if they really occurred as we have them, there are at least 2 events that would alter Israel's calendar, whereby the priest would have to adjust that calendar over time. Probably very quickly, one after they came into the land, and then again later on after Hezekiah. So let me tell you those 2 events. One would have been Moses' long day, where supposedly the earth stood still or the sun stood still, depending on the perspective. That would have had some sort of consequence regarding the calendar. You also have Hezekiah's long day, where it moved back 45 degrees, which ends up being, no, 10 degrees, which ends up being 45 minutes. So when you put those calculations astronomically, some things I have read is that it makes the day have a quarter of a day was the effect of those things. You know, that's what I haven't come across anything very scholarly, and the treatments that I have on it have really pros and cons each way. But if these stories really happened, if they did occur, that is something you definitely have to take into consideration. So at some point in time, Israel's priesthood would have had to have made an adjustment to the biblical calendar to account for that anomaly between the solar and the lunar cycle. So again, astronomy was one branch of ancient Israel's government Levitical function, taxation. Now, this is what I really, really love this discussion, because Yahovah, in his infinite wisdom, makes taxation a constitutional value. He doesn't leave it for generations to discuss a flat tax, or to decide, how much is reasonable or how much is fair. You've got to pay your fair share. Well, God tells us that the only amount that the state is entitled to is a flat 10%. Now, this 10% is not based on your gross income. It is actually based on your net income. So this is a very reasonable commitment to the state. And again, the basis of my investigation, the question that I had to seek to answer was, is God's law fair? It would compare it even to today and look at the taxes that the United States government requires. If you're in a certain tax bracket, it's almost up to 60%. Corporate taxes are very high. Individual taxes can be well over 50%. And so you're really penalized by making more money. Israel didn't have that. It was this idea of this flat percent. No matter what your income, you paid a percentage. So it was very fair and very reasonable. As you get into the laws that are the taxes that are banned. So let's look at, I'm going to look at page 179, and we're just going to go through this. The type of taxation that is constitutionally defined are a 10% of all combined yearly income. So you had this, so if you made money off of IRAs, if you made money off of investments, investment income, today some of that is not taxed. In ancient Israel, that would have been taxed. Any sort of investment income that you had would be taxed. But it was a flat 10% of all your income. It didn't matter if you were a corporation, or if you were a small business owner, or if you were, just a sole entrepreneurship. You all had the same rate. So it was a very fair, in that regard, playing field. Now, who paid this tax? First of all, you had the Ezrek citizens. This was the native-born citizens. And it really applied to anyone within the land of Israel earning an income. If they're outside the land of Israel earning an income, the state really wouldn't be that interested in incomes earned abroad, but I'm sure that would be a discussion that would have to be revisited in our modern day, in our modern era. The other one thing that we have, and this is, to me, was kind of interesting, because today we're all familiar with the child earned income credit, where you get $500 or maybe $1,500 per child to encourage you to have children. In Israel's society, it was a little differently, because today, when we have kids, what happens? Well, let's see, we pay for their clothing, we pay for their medical expenses, we pay for their education, we pay for their cars, pay for their toys, pay for their electronics. So today we're on the hook for a lot of things, and those children aren't really contributing a lot of value economically to the family. They're taking a lot. So the government encourages you to have more children with this earned income credit. In ancient Israel, it was the exact opposite, where when you had children, they became employees. As soon as, by the age of 6, 7, 8, they were actually, working half a day. They were contributing to the family, and they were making more money, in various ways. So it's really come full circle. So in ancient Israel's time, you would pay a tax on that child. Because it was a value-added tax. That child added value to your family, value to your estate. And it's something that made you better off. The other thing that is very different from today. Is that when, and you know, to me, I just get very, very, not quite as bad as these preachers that say sow your seed, but I just find it very unjust with the misdemeanor crime and the fee structure that we have, where I've known several people who were very indigent. You know, these are people that are going to make under, say, $20,000-$30,000 a year, and they have families. Some of them, maybe they only make $10,000 a year. They may get traffic tickets, and rather than the ticket being in proportion to the income that they bring in, they may get a $250, $500 fine for having too many traffic tickets, for driving without a driver's license, or all of these things. And they're unable to go to their job and go to work. So they really become in this position where it's almost impossible for them to get out of it. You don't find Torah embracing this standard one-size-fits-all misdemeanor penalty. You find that it's graduated, where the person who makes more money is going to pay a higher fine than the person with less money. So it's a very fair system. It's a very equitable system. And really what I love about this even more is that in ancient Israel's economy and their political system, if you were a government leader, if you were a person in a position of authority and you committed a crime, maybe you didn't pay all your taxes, maybe you had tax evasion, or maybe you broke a crime, you know, you broke a law, you stole somebody, maybe you embezzled. If you were in a position of leadership, or maybe you had some emails on your server that you weren't supposed to have, you paid 5 or 6 times the amount of what the average citizen would pay. So there were steep penalties if you were in a position of trust and a position of authority and you abused that. That did not apply to the average citizen, and certainly did not apply to those who were indigent. Now, unlike today, one type of tax that was totally banned, and you know, governments would not like this at all today, property taxes. Property taxes were not assessed whatsoever. Property improvement taxes were not assessed. It was really based solely on income. And that is how the government was expected to function, was strictly off of the income taxes. Now, you did have an issue of different ways that the priesthood could also earn revenue. They could release lands, and I don't remember exactly, because I didn't have time to look at some of this in detail today, because I've been getting ready for my trip. But you find that the priesthood would buy the grain from the land, so that say a person wanted to lease their land, say either they were not farmers, they did not want to farm, or maybe they wanted to go live in the city, but they still wanted that revenue from their land. They would sell the produce of that land to the priesthood for a certain ratio, so that a bushel or an ephah would get maybe $5 or $15, whatever the going rate was of the day. So you find that the priesthood would buy that presumably at a lower price, and then they would sell it through the temple to the general populace, maybe those people who lived in the cities. And that was another way for the priesthood to earn money, as well as for the citizen to earn a revenue. So the person who had crops and grew, had those type of commodities, they were almost always guaranteed a buyer. Now, here's the other way the priesthood could make money, is by selling those abroad. You know, if there's a time of famine, or say Israel produced more than other nations, they could export those, and the priesthood would make a greater profit, perhaps, than selling it even within the land. So there were some other ways that Israel had for earning income. I'm listening. I couldn't tell if those were tornado sirens going off or not, but they're not, thankfully. If you look at the chart on page 179, you see how these government funds were to be allocated. They're for government support. They're for support of the temple. And then again, you see that certain taxations are banned. The other thing, and I don't get into it here, I'm just going to briefly mention it. There was a difference in taxation for your native citizen versus those people who were not native citizens. Maybe they were working aliens. A lot of times part of that taxation went to support the indigent, your orphans and your widows. And we're going to look at that a little bit more in depth as we go on. You know, and again, let me just draw a little distinction between this idea of sin offerings. You know, sin offerings were not tithes or taxes. Sin offerings were taxes, they were not tithes. So that was an additional form of revenue for the state. And you know, this idea that when you sin and you brought your sin offering, which was usually an animal, you would actually sit down and you would eat that meal with the priest. There'd be a lot of counseling going on. There would be a lot of talking, a lot of education, and a lot of relationship building in that time that you're sitting there having that meal with the priest. So it was something that really made the community strong. It had a lot of very strong ties. You also find that there was limits placed on the poor, so that if you did not earn an income, if you were, say, beneath a certain threshold where you did not earn enough income, you didn't even pay any taxes. Your taxes were really just off of an income producing estate that had income. So say you had a widow who had her husband's land that she and her children lived on. They didn't really have any income. Well, they had a place to live. They lived there tax-free, but they did not have the stress of having to meet that demand of the state. You also find that as I get into the idea of healthcare, and I was very surprised with, and to me, this is one of the incredible dichotomies that you see between what separated ancient Israel society and what separated other nations. And it's something that we really see today in American politics. And it's interesting to see the ideas that scripture embraces. So believe it or not, the idea of universal health care is nothing new. It's nothing modern. Ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Greece were all nations that provided some sort of government-sponsored health care. We find that Egypt, they would provide health care to their workers, to their engineers, you know, trying to get them well and back onto the monumental building processes. You'd also find that in Mesopotamia, you had a system of drugs being administered by the state. You had not rations and quotas, but you had a system of price control that was set by the state where prices were fixed. Greece, which was the maximum. I mean, there was nobody that provided better healthcare than the Greeks. And you would go to, in this case, the temple of Asclepius to receive healing. And these priests, every single time you sought health care, you always had an intermediary. You could really never just pray to the god or go to the god yourself. And you really didn't even know which god to go to, because you had different deities that were always competing and warring. So you had to usually seek either to your ancestors to find out which god you had offended, or seek to the priest to find out why you were ill and which god had afflicted you. So these could involve elaborate incantation processes where you paid a very handsome, you paid once for the ritual, you paid again for all the medicinal supplies or for the images, kind of like this voodoo healing. You paid every single time, and sometimes they were very elaborate. You know, we have this concoction, this recipe that was made for an Assyrian king, and the priests say, you know, oh, behold, we can't make this. This is too elaborate. You know, it takes so much. So that is, you know, was a very part of a reality of ancient Near Eastern healthcare. You also find a dichotomy between Mesopotamia and Israel and the Greeks. In Mesopotamia and Israel, there was always this idea that sin produced some sort of negative consequence where healthcare was concerned. So in other words, in Israel, you would have departed from the law to some degree. Something would have entered into society, maybe not you personally, but at least society, and it would have produced adverse health. Maybe a virus or a disease breaks out. In Mesopotamia, for ancient Israel, it was always the idea that you had violated that way of life, or the community had violated that way of life. In Mesopotamia, it was the idea that ill health occurred because you had offended one of the gods, or maybe a relative had offended one of the gods, and you're suffering because of what somebody else did. That was a little different from Israel, because in Israel, it was always you suffering from your own sins, although there was this idea that, if somebody does something, it could still affect you. Greece was the exact opposite. In ancient Greece, you find that there was no relationship whatsoever to sin or to sickness or illness or disease in any way. They were just totally unrelated. Sometimes it was the gods just arbitrarily chose to afflict you, but you just sought to them for healing. But there was never really this connection between the idea of sin and illness. You also find that the government assumed state responsibility. So you would go to the priesthood, which was a state entity. You would pay money to be healed. You would pay money for the incantations. Sometimes the priesthood would honestly make it worse, and sometimes their pharmaceuticals were not so bad, and it helped a little bit. But if you read some of the Egyptian recipes, bile from a faithful wife, grease goose, hair from a horse, and you mix them all together, you take them internally, you can only imagine what type of health you'd end up with if you stayed on those potions for too long. But, coming back to this idea of an intermediary, there was never in other ancient religions, there was never this idea that you could seek directly to the deity. You always had to have someone go on your behalf, except for ancient Israel. Ancient Israel was the only nation where you could go directly to God and plead for healing. And this is brought home in the case of Hannah, who she's not able to have children, so she seeks to God for healing. And Eli thinks that she's drunk and that she's just, drunk and stammering in the temple and just moving her lips. And notice there is a woman in the temple. This kind of goes against some modern interpretations of scripture, but she's in the temple, and she's praying for healing, that she can have children. She didn't have to go to Eli. Eli and priest weren't even part of this process. She appeals directly to God and she's healed. Hezekiah, he's told that, he has a boil, he's sick. This abscess is, back then they didn't have the antibiotics that we do today. So he's told that he will die from this abscess. He appeals directly to God, not even in the temple. He appeals to God for healing, and God heals his prayer and hears his prayer, and he provides healing outside of the temple. So you find that, Israel is in Egypt. Israel is oppressed, and they pray to God and they ask for deliverance. He hears them in Egypt directly and responds. So that in Israel, you never had and this is a dichotomy between ancient Israel and other religions, you never had an intermediary, because you could always seek directly to God. Now, we find in Israel's religious beliefs, when you compare Israel to the cults of the day, to Ashtoreth, to Baal, to Marduk, which would have been an Assyrian god, you find that they were very plain. It didn't have a lot of the very emotionally satisfying rituals in Israel that you had in Mesopotamia and that you had in Egypt. And you find that in a lot of the tenor of ancient Israel's accusations was that ancient Israel's constitutionally based religion, because really it was more of a political and constitutionally based philosophy holistic way of life than what it actually was, a religion, it left this certain religious emptiness when compared to other nations. So you find that in other nations, there are cases where they were healed. There are cases where we have, this idea that they take this concoction, and all of a sudden they feel that they've been healed. And, I call this the placebo effect, where sometimes you believe something strong enough that sometimes it just happens, and you're healed or you're cured. But that's not lasting, and that's not something that will transcend to the entire society. So YHWH's healthcare doctrine really provided a very realistic approach to disease. As we get into chapters 6 and 7, especially in chapter 6, we're going to see that God's entire law, his entire approach to national health care was focused on prevention, not so much on curing disease, but on preventing it through diet, through lifestyle, through everything, through the stress that is placed on society. His idea was prevention. When you study, as we will see next week, the societies that follow a Torah-based lifestyle, what we know from medical science and research is that when you study those societies that followed that exact prescription, they demonstrate a very low rate of certain diseases. And that is just, to me, incredible testimony to the validity of the law and the fact that a lot of what is prescribed there is indeed valid. I don't see where man can just have made this stuff up, because medical science did not know what we know today, and did not have this education and these resources at their disposal. So that concludes chapter 5. I do see a comment here that I'm going to grab. Maria says, where did you come to that conclusion that not everyone paid tithes? Sounds beneficial, but I don't remember seeing that in the text. If you look at the scriptures that I quote regarding the taxation, you had to have income, and you had to have a net income. So if your expenses exceeded your gross, then you would not have paid taxes, because taxation was always on the net and not the gross. And I do show that in the book. If you'll read, it's going to be right around, let me go back to the page, between pages 177 and 180 is where I discussed that. The other thing, and I didn't mention this before, under the priesthood, taxation was limited to 10%. But Samuel very strongly states, and he, protests to Israel in 1 Samuel chapter 8, saying that the monarchy is going to add extra taxation. They're going to add extra requirements that are not constitutional. And you find that there probably was another 5 to 10%, so maybe a maximum of 20% tax liability under the monarchy, that it took for maintaining a standing army, that it took for maintaining and the armaments for a military, the chariots, the weapons, because there were swords, and that cost money to produce all of those swords and those weapons of the day. There was the palace. The palace had an elaborate staff. There was monies that had to be put into that had to be acquired through taxation. So you do find that in ancient Israel's economy under the monarchy, that taxation may have exceeded that 10%. We are not told how much. I theorize it may have been an additional 5%, but in reality, it could have been much higher. Now, we will be taking a 2-week break. We will meet again, let me tell you here. So if you are behind, please take this time to catch up. So that way, when we come back, our next class will be November 20th. So 2 weeks to catch up, 2 weeks to work ahead. We will be starting in chapter 6, and we will be going through, let's see, I think we go all the way through the diseases. Yeah, we're going to be going all the way through page 204. So I look forward to seeing you all next week. Any questions? I'm going to hang around here just a minute. And if you guys have any questions, please post them. It's always so neat when you guys, you know, sometimes I learn something or think of something that I hadn't considered before based on what you guys say. And Maria says, are those studies by Donald Patton? I'm not familiar with Donald Patton, or at least it doesn't ring a bell, Maria. Maria says, I've seen 3 tithes in scripture, the flat tax, the Sukkot tithe, and the one for the storehouses every 3rd year. You know, I theorize that all of those came from the flat tax, and that they were simply allocated differently, so that in different years you taxed and you gave according to, for different purposes. I could be wrong, but that is how I understand it. And Marty Stevens also, and I really recommend his book. It's called Tithes and Taxation in Ancient Israel. But, and again, his name is Marty Stevens. And if you look up the source there that I have on, I think it's page 176. Let me go back over here. It's a very lucid discussion of the evidence. Yeah, well, page 175. Look at the reference for that quote. He really provides some interesting perspective on economics in ancient Israel. So yes, I will be in Israel for the next 2 weeks. Follow me on Facebook, Twitter. I will be posting pictures, maybe doing some podcasts. Not exactly sure what we're going to do, but you know, we're going to have an awesome time. I wish you guys were going with us, but we'll take you in heart and in spirit, and we will see you back on November 20th. So have a wonderful week and a restful Shabbat, and we will see you later. So any other questions again? All right, I'm going to go ahead and close it down.